Welcome back to In the Gig. We've already recapped plenty of the good racing action that's happened over the past week or so, and even looked ahead to some of the great racing action that's coming up in Australia over the next few weeks and even months. But it's not just here in Australia, there's great racing happening across the ditch as well, and as we do each and every week, it's time to catch up with Michael Guerin. And Mick, great to have you on the show once more. We'll address the impressive win of Copy That again in 2 ticks, but I also want to have a look ahead to the new Brighton Cup. There's plenty of great racing coming our way from New Zealand.
Yeah, hi Ben, welcome back. It's going to be a fun race on Friday night at Addington. At the moment, the open class races, much like the state racing around Australia, feels like one good horse per race and they keep winning. This Friday night, that good horse at Addington is probably self-assured. He'll be around $1.40 to win the New Brighton Cup. But as everybody saw 2 weeks ago, his standing start manners less than ideal, and barrier 2 this week again means he'll have to come down early into a standing start position. So he's no good thing, but he is dominating the south. Copy That, as we've seen already, dominating the north. The interesting thing about this race is AG's White Sox. That remarkable story of 2 weeks ago when he had an atrial fibrillation in the race, in the first race he had been driven in since Ricky May drove him and suffered a human equivalent back at Omakau on January the 2nd. Those races 9 months apart. One, the man has a heart problem and pulled out of the race and nearly died. The second one, AG's White Sox had an atrial fibrillation and got pulled out of the race. The chances, the odds of that, Ben, almost impossible to work out.
It certainly is a funny story, isn't it, Mick? But AG's White Sox issue, obviously, on the extent, not quite as bad, nowhere near as bad, and it's something that they can quite often bounce back from. We spoke 7 days ago about the change of season here in Australia to a calendar year. Your, I guess, initial thoughts were that New Zealand wouldn't be too keen to go down the same path. No doubt your phone has been ringing hot since then. What is the general consensus from not only administrators there in New Zealand but also participants? Are they keen to make the move now that Australia has?
Britt, I think there's some people who are quite keen. I've had people on the executive of Harness Racing New Zealand contact me and say, hey, I'm advocating for it. But the general consensus out of the executive is no at this stage. Now, it does sound ideal to have uniformity between the two countries, but let's not forget, and let's be bluntly honest about this, Harness Racing Australia have made some pretty weird calls in the last 5 years, and if New Zealand had followed them, where would they have ended up? We had a conference after an Inter-Dominion final in Perth 4 or 5 years ago where we were told by HRA there's no more whip. The whip's disappeared. Well, guess what? The whip's still there. Had New Zealand followed them and taken the whip away from the horse people, what do? Do we go back on our word when Harness Racing Australia did? Same as the stallion limits for the stallion books going to 150. New Zealand doesn't believe that's the way they should do business. If they do it the way Australia does it, do they start to lose some of these high quality imports into New Zealand? I think Harness Racing Australia, I'm not saying they are going down the wrong path with this, but they have sometimes cried wolf, and at the moment Harness Racing New Zealand's more keen to see how things evolve with them rather than following them, because quite bluntly a couple of things they said they were going to do, they simply didn't.
All right, Mick, what about some of the stars from New Zealand that we might get to see in this country a little later on in the year? And is there any Aussies coming over to New Zealand to compete in the carnival coming up shortly?
Gee, I think the main one's going to be Cruz Bromack, the defending New Zealand Cup champion. I'm pretty sure he will come back because he can just transfer stables. He can go join Mark Purdon and Natalie Rasmussen. He's been there plenty of times before. I'm sure there's people watching this show who would like to bring their horses, but it's a far more complex problem than usual for obvious reasons. Most horse trainers or people couldn't get into New Zealand. You can't just jump on a plane and come to New Zealand. There's a quota on how many people can actually come into the country, much like there is with Australia. And I think very few horse people are willing to give their best horse away, not only for the entirety of the spring and summer, but of course the 14 days each way they're in quarantine. That's a month. where you can't train your own horse. Those open class stocks in New Zealand are starting to rebuild. 2 years ago, New Zealand cut one of the Fixer back at the trials today, Spank him back at the trials last week. But outside of Cruise Bromac, I can't see many Australians turning up for the carnivals here. And to be honest, I think the appetite from New Zealanders to even try to get into Australia is diminishing for things like the Breeders' Crown. I think it'll be early next year before we see any concerted push. And what is far more likely from those I've spoken to is people transferring their horses to other trainers in Australia rather than sending horses and staff on bulk, because it's simply the economics doesn't work out when you're quarantining 14 days each way at this stage.
Just quick, Mick, so do you expect Mark Purdon and Ali Rasmussen to be in Australia in the early part of 2021, or they just simply send their horses over here?
Very good question, Gareth, because it's going to reshape a lot of markets. I don't think they'll be going to the Breeders' Crown. I think they may send one or two horses, but it's a very busy time in New Zealand, the new Breeders' Crown time. So I don't think they'll go. After the Auckland Cup on December 31, there's not a great deal of major racing in New Zealand, so you might see a Self-Assured and those type of horses head across. Again, you know Mark Purdon and Natalie Rasmussen. Do you see them spending 14 days in quarantine in a hotel? I don't see it happening. I think if the horses from New Zealand do go, they're more likely to go and join Australian trainers. Most of the major New Zealand trainers already have those associations. But New Zealand horses en masse in Australia anytime soon? I don't think so.
All right, Mick, thank you very much for your wrap. Mick Guerin there from across the ditch, and just throwing a polite amount of shade over our direction as well, which is always refreshing. We're going to head off to a break. When we get back, our Drive of the Week countdown in Not All Heroes Wear Capes.